I was 7 when she first called me the failure. The words hit like ice water, spreading through my chest and settling somewhere deep where they would live for the next 20 years. My stepmom Sandra stood in our kitchen, her perfectly manicured, fingers gripping a coffee mug, her eyes cold as winter glass. "Your sister gets straight A's, and you can barely pass 3rd grade. Face it, honey, you're just the failure of this family." The smell of burnt toast filled the silence that followed. I remember the way the morning light slanted through our yellow curtains, how the refrigerator hummed its constant tune, how my father said nothing. He just folded his newspaper higher, hiding behind headlines about distant wars while his daughter's heart shattered at his kitchen table. "I'm trying," I whispered, my small voice barely audible above the dishwasher's cycle. Sandra laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Trying isn't enough when you're competing with excellence. Your sister was reading chapter books at your age. You still struggle with picture books." She set her mug down with a sharp clink. "Some people are just born to succeed, and others—" She gestured at me with casual cruelty. "Others are born to remind us what failure looks like." I felt my face burn with shame. My homework lay scattered across the table. Math problems that seemed to dance and blur no matter how hard I concentrated. The numbers wouldn't stay still. The letters wouldn't make sense. And every mistake felt like proof that Sandra was right. I was the failure. I was the reminder. "Maybe she has a learning disability," my father finally said, his voice muffled behind newsprint. "Don't make excuses. For laziness, Richard. The girl needs to face reality." Sandra's heels clicked against the linoleum as she moved toward me. "You want to know what reality is, sweetheart? Reality is that your sister will go to college, get a good job, marry well. You?" She tilted her head with mock sympathy. "You'll be lucky if you graduate high school." That night, I lay in my single bed listening to the house settle around me. Through the thin walls, I could hear Sandra and my father talking in low voices. "She's just not bright, Richard. It's not her fault, but we can't pretend she's something she's not. The sooner she accepts her limitations, the better off she'll be." I pressed my face into my pillow and made a promise to the darkness. Someday, somehow, I would prove her wrong. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I knew that the word failure would not define me forever. The label followed me everywhere. To school, where I struggled with reading comprehension while my classmates seemed to absorb information effortlessly. To family dinners, where Sandra would praise my sister's achievements while I sat silent, knowing that any mention of my small victories would be dismissed. To my bedroom, where I'd practice reading aloud to my stuffed animals, determined to improve despite the words that still danced and blurred before my eyes. Years later, I learned I had dyslexia. But by then, the damage was done. I had internalized. Sandra's voice made it my own. Every challenge became proof of my inadequacy. Every setback confirmed what I already believed about myself. High school was a battlefield where I fought for every grade, every achievement. When I graduated, not with honors, but I graduated, Sandra's response was a shrug. "Congratulations on doing the bare minimum," she said, her attention already turning to my sister's college acceptance letters. But something had shifted in me during those high school years. Maybe it was the economics teacher who saw potential in my unconventional thinking, or the part-time job at a local business where I discovered I had an intuitive understanding of customer service and operations. Slowly, carefully, I began to build a different story about myself. College wasn't easy. I chose a state school, paid my own way through part-time jobs and student loans. While my sister studied abroad and joined sororities, I worked at the campus bookstore and discovered a passion for business. I may have struggled with traditional academics, but I understood people, what they wanted, what they needed, how to solve their problems. My professors noticed. "You have an entrepreneurial mind," one told me after I presented a business plan that approached a common problem from an entirely new angle. "You see solutions where others see obstacles." I clung to those words like a lifeline. For the first time in my life, someone was telling me I wasn't a failure. I was different. My mind worked in ways that traditional education couldn't measure or appreciate. The dyslexia that had made reading so difficult had also given me the ability to see patterns and connections that others missed. After graduation, I moved across the country, as far from Sandra's voice as I could get. I took a job with a small consulting firm, working with struggling businesses. I discovered I had a gift for seeing what wasn't working and finding creative solutions. Within 2 years, I was leading my own projects. Within 5, I was ready to strike out on my own. The early days of my business were brutal. I worked 18-hour days from my studio apartment, living on instant ramen and determination. There were nights when Sandra's voice crept back in, whispering that I was proving her right, that I was destined to fail. But I had learned to recognize that voice for what it was. Not truth, but trauma. Not fact, but fear. My breakthrough came when I developed a new approach to organizational efficiency that saved my first major client over $2 million in their first year. Word spread. Contracts multiplied. I hired employees, moved to a real office, then a bigger one. The company I built specialized in turning around failing businesses. There was poetry in that, though I didn't realize it at the time. Within 10 years, my firm had grown to 50 employees. Within 15, we had offices in 3 states. I had become the kind of success story that business magazines write about. The entrepreneur who built something from nothing, who saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. But success hadn't healed the wound. Even as my bank account grew and my reputation soared, I carried Sandra's words with me. They had become part of my inner landscape, a constant whisper that no amount of achievement could silence. Until the day I decided to buy a house. I had been living in a series of rentals and corporate housing, always temporary, always ready to move for the next opportunity. But at 37, I was ready to put down roots. I wanted something beautiful, something that would finally prove to myself, if no one else, that I had made it. My realtor showed me dozens of properties, but nothing felt right until we pulled up to a colonial on Maple Street. It was perfect. Mature trees, a wraparound porch, the kind of house that whispered home before you even walked through the door. The owners are highly motivated, my realtor said as we climbed the front steps. They're facing some financial difficulties and need to sell quickly. The house was everything I'd dreamed of. Hardwood floors, a gourmet kitchen, a master suite, with a view of the garden. I was ready to make an offer on the spot. But as we walked through the living room, I noticed family photos on the mantel. My breath caught in my throat. There was my father, 20 years older but unmistakable. And there was Sandra, her hair silver now, but her smile the same cold curve I remembered. This was their house. The house where they'd lived after my sister, and I had grown up and moved away. The house they'd bought with my father's retirement money. What did you say the owners' names were? I asked, my voice carefully controlled. My realtor flipped through her paperwork. Richard and Sandra Morrison. The irony was so perfect it felt like destiny. The woman who had called me a failure, who had predicted I'd never amount to anything, was now desperate to sell her house to avoid foreclosure. And I, the failure, had the power to buy it. I spent that night researching their situation. It wasn't pretty. My father's medical bills had drained their savings. Sandra's small business had failed during the recession. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage, facing bankruptcy. The very home that had represented their success was now the symbol of their downfall. Part of me wanted revenge. Part of me wanted to walk away. But the biggest part of me wanted something else entirely. I wanted to look Sandra in the eye and show her exactly who I had become. I made an offer the next morning. Full asking price, cash, with a quick closing. I also made one special request. I wanted to be present when they signed the papers, and I wanted to present the check personally. The closing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. I arrived early, wearing my best suit, the same designer brand Sandra used to say I'd never be able to afford. I had grown into my confidence over the years, learned to carry myself like the successful businesswoman I had become. But my hands still shook as I waited in the conference room. When Sandra walked in, she looked older, wearier than I remembered. The years had carved lines around her eyes, softened the sharp edges of her cruelty. She didn't recognize me at first. I was just another suit in a room full of lawyers and paperwork. "Ms. Morrison," the attorney said, "I'd like you to meet the buyer." I stood up, extended my hand. "Hello, Sandra." The recognition hit her like a physical blow. Her face went white, then red, then white again. She looked at me, at the papers on the table, at the check with my company's logo, at the lawyers who were waiting for her signature. "You," she whispered. "Me," I confirmed. The failure. My father, who had been silent through the entire process, looked up from the papers he'd been signing. "Sweetheart, is that really you?" "Hello, Dad." I kept my voice steady, professional. "I hope you're both well." Sandra's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I could see her mind racing, trying to process what was happening. The little girl she had labeled a failure was now the woman who held her financial future in her hands. "I understand you're facing some difficulties," I said gently. "I want you to know that I'm prepared to expedite this process. You can have your check today, and I won't require you to move out for 60 days. That should give you time to find a new place." "I don't understand," Sandra said, her voice barely audible. When did you? "I built a business," I said simply. "It turns out I'm pretty good at fixing things that other people have given up on, including myself." The attorney cleared his throat. "If we could proceed with the signatures." As Sandra signed paper after paper, transferring ownership of her home to me, I watched 20 years of anger and hurt transform into something else. Not forgiveness, that would come later, if it came at all, but understanding. Sandra had been wrong about me, catastrophically wrong, but she had also been afraid. Afraid that my struggles reflected on her, afraid that my differences meant deficiency, afraid that love meant having to make excuses for imperfection. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, looking up from the papers. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything." I nodded. "Yes, you were." "What will you do with the house?" I had been thinking about that all week. "I'm going to renovate it," I said. "Turn it into something beautiful, something that reflects possibility instead of limitation." When the closing was finished, I walked out to my car, a Mercedes I'd bought myself for my 35th birthday, and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment. I thought about the 7-year-old girl who had cried herself to sleep because someone had called her a failure. I thought about the woman I had become, who had just purchased the house where that label had first been applied. The wound wasn't healed. I don't think wounds like that ever fully heal. But it had been transformed. The word failure no longer defined me. Instead, it had become the fuel that powered my success, the reminder that other people's limitations are not my own. I started the engine and drove away from the house that would soon be mine, away from the woman who had underestimated me so completely. In my rearview mirror, I could see Sandra standing in the parking lot, watching me go. I wondered what she was thinking, what she was feeling, but for the first time in 30 years, I didn't need to know. I had finally proven her wrong. Not just about my potential, but about the very nature of failure itself. Failure isn't falling down. It's staying down. And I had never, ever stayed down. The failure had become the woman who owned the house. The cycle was complete.